thanks to everybody for joining. I'll just start doing our opening comments and to say how pleased I am that we're able to have this discussion today on a topic that I think needs a lot more attention. Let me first begin by welcoming everybody online and hope that everybody is well in these really strange circumstances we live in now. This is our penultimate webinar in our series that we've been holding from my office on ending sexual harassment. We started in March, and we will be completing our series day after tomorrow on Thursday with a wrap-up discussion on where we are now and what comes next. Now, the office has spent just over 2 years, nearly 2.5 years, working to uncover, to make connections, to strengthen alliances, to set out standards and remind everybody that there are already existing commitments to end sexual harassment. We have offered elements of a definition, which include that sexual harassment is primarily a creature of gender inequality that intersects with other forms of discrimination. Discrimination that can include sex and gender to start with, but also disability, age, race, immigration status, indigenous status, sexual orientation. There are many ways in which socially and structurally we make people unequal, and sexual harassment reflects and feeds these inequalities. We talk about sexual harassment as unwelcome sexual conduct. We focus particularly on the world of work and education, but we know it happens in many places, on public transport, in the streets, and elsewhere too. We're interested in ensuring that action is taken that places the experiences and fears and hopes of those on the front line of being targeted for sexual harassment at the core. We understand that we will not really build true knowledge and effective work if we don't really appreciate and learn from those who have experienced sexual harassment and those who have actually not reported or shared their experiences in particular, because we have to understand why that happens and what we can do about changing it. We have proposed some core elements of policy and practice drafted by our advisor on ending sexual harassment, Professor Catherine McKinnon. They are available in our publication called Towards an End to Sexual Harassment, and we will share a link to this online. But beyond policy and practice, we're very conscious that what happens around sexual harassment and the inequality of power is that attitudes and norms and the ways we think shape what we do and what we don't do. And so we have dedicated some time and energy to talking about the cultural context in which sexual harassment exists, is permitted to exist, and in which the search that victims and survivors make for justice is contaminated, is stymied, and is not really delivered. That publication is called What Will It Take? And we will also share a link with that. A third publication we issued in March looks at training to end sexual harassment. Now, most organizations, especially when they are challenged or criticized on their work around sexual harassment, say, but we have a policy and we do training. Well, many, many decades of work on training has shown its shortcomings, and we have issued a paper that explains and summarizes these critiques, but also offers a way forward that gives guidelines and suggestions for how to do effective training on sexual harassment. And we call effective training that which actually changes behavior, not that which makes the organizations tick a box here and there. We are going on now to 2 more publications, one that was issued just last week on the 2 of the topics that we feel are fairly under-attended to in the discussions and work to end sexual harassment, and those are disability and the informal sector. Last week, we issued a paper that was born of many, many consultations, and again, we can share that link online around sexual harassment of women and girls with disabilities. We think it's a very important piece. We hope we've helped to try and join the dots a little bit between gender inequality and disability, and hope that we've given a little bit more attention to an area of work that hasn't had adequate focus or heard properly from those on the front lines, women with disabilities. Today, we'd also like to shine a spotlight particularly on the informal sector, where millions of women across the world are concentrated in earning their daily income. We want to do this because we feel it's an area where those on the front line, the workers who are there, actually need more support, need more recognition, and more action to take seriously the conditions in which they live and work. We have particularly focused on two areas which really most places in the world would find relevant, and those are domestic work and farm work, agricultural work. Let me just say quickly something about the paper, and then I'll be really happy to introduce our three speakers. Now, informality, the sector where people are not contracted under or recognized often by legal provisions, provides many, many challenges in terms of recognizing and addressing to end sexual harassment. People often don't have contracts. They often work for very low pay. They tend not to be covered by legal protections against violence and abuse. They often work away from public gaze, in the fields, in people's homes, and in their own homes. They often have to do piecework or do street trading, street vending, where there isn't an ease with which they can organize, organize together to negotiate better conditions, to think about how to push and advocate for change to laws, to procedures that will benefit their dignity and their ability to have decency at work. They also often lack support from the trade unions and labour unions that could be there for them. This isn't necessarily true everywhere, but it is a condition that many have to struggle with. Now, we have set some of this out in the paper and focused in on domestic work and agricultural work. I will say very little about this because we have amazing speakers lined up to do so, and we will also hear a little bit from my colleague Celeste, who drafted the report. Let me just say now, welcome to everybody. I see that we have a lot more people online, and we would like to move to hearing from our speakers. Then we will save sufficient time for discussion and to look at questions that people might want to put. If you could do so in the Q&A box, then we can see them and perhaps reply in written form as well as by speaking to you. Let me also note that there are captions available throughout this webinar. If you see the closed caption box at the bottom of the screen, you can click on there and access those captions. Thank you all for joining us. Let me now turn to our speakers with a quick introduction, and we will put their bios properly online in the chat box so you can see them at your leisure. We'll hear first from the ILO in the form of Carla Henry, who is a senior specialist in the research department at the ILO, and who I must say provided a lot of the original research and documentation on which we drew for this paper. Her bio will be shared with you in the chat box. Thank you, Carla, for joining us. After Carla, we'll go to Liz Broderick in Australia. We're moving around the world a little bit with our speakers today, who is the chair and rapporteur of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. She has a lot of experience around working on violence and discrimination, and I know that she will raise some really important points for us to consider today too. Lastly, we'll hear from our invited guest, Myrtle Witbooi, who is the General Secretary of the South African Domestic Service and Allied Workers Union, and she's also President of the International Domestic Workers Federation. Myrtle, we're delighted to have you and look forward to hearing from you. We'll hear from each of you in that order, and then I'll turn to Celeste for some comments about writing the paper. So, Carla, may I come to you first? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Purna, for introducing me and also for including this issue related to farm work under the auspices of sexual violence and harassment. I think it's an issue that hasn't gotten its fair due in terms of recognition of how maybe pervasive the problem is in many countries. It gets in the news in many of the North American, European countries because you have incidents that capture people's attention, and that suggests to some extent that it is not as pervasive, that it does make the news. That same situation is not necessarily true when you get into lower and middle income countries. You have a much larger share of the population working in agriculture. More and more, it's moving towards what I would call commercial agriculture, and many of the workers are waged workers and actually have an employment relationship. So they're no longer workers on a family farm, but they're people who are being employed to provide labor for these agri companies. Let me just, I'm going to have to put you a little bit out of the way, but let me just talk a little bit about the commercial agriculture. And first of all, just the scale of the number of people working in it. Overall, there's just under 1 billion people who depend on agriculture for their livelihoods globally. And of those, about 450 million work in commercial agriculture. And of those, about 1/4 are women. So you have 100 million women who work in commercial agriculture, which is quite a large number. And these jobs in commercial agriculture are not particularly desirable. They're very rarely, at least for women, they're very rarely full-time. So they're usually, they can be full-time, but they're very often temporary, even seasonal work. So they may not even be a formal contract or arrangement. They may actually be a formal job, so it's not necessarily an informal worker, but the work situation is quite tough, and very often working conditions are dangerous, and protections offering other employees are not available to farm workers. In middle-income countries, you also tend to see some of those workers coming from local communities, although there are also migrants coming in to provide agricultural work season by season. So you get a mix of both, but you're more likely to see people from the local community in lower and middle income countries than you are, say, in a lot of the North American, European countries. So this is very much a non-standard employment arrangement, and you also have the complexity that often these workers are brought in through third-party labor contractors. So they're not even employed by the companies or the farms that they're working on, which gives them a distance and an added layer of vulnerability. And I think as Purna mentioned, you have a situation where the legal protections and frameworks in which farm workers operate are very uneven across countries. And very often, unfortunately, you have a lot of the labor laws and protections and services provided to regular formal workers missing for agriculture in general, simply because it's costly to provide that level of coverage. And second, because some of those laws actually exclude agriculture from coverage based on the idea that agriculture was once about family farms, which is not necessarily the case anymore. Okay, so let me just get a little bit to what's happening inside agriculture related to sexual harassment and violence. And I include violence in my coverage because there is sexual violence, unfortunately. And a lot of what's happening is between workers, so it's not facing a client, and it includes the mix of different kinds of workers, including supervisors and managers. One of the big challenges is to try to capture a sense of the scale to which this is happening or exists among farm workers globally. But it's very difficult because there isn't methodology for really measuring, and there are no global estimates that exist at this time. And that's one of the reasons why Jacqueline Adams and I did a synthesis review of what literature is out there to try to establish what we know about this. And so just anecdotally, looking at some of the studies that have been completed, we're looking at very high incidence of sexual harassment and violence, anywhere from 2/3, 3/4 in some areas, up to 90% have experienced some form of harassment and violence. At the lowest level, this can be, whistling, lewd gestures, insinuating comments, sort of off jokes related and vulgar gestures. These things, a lot of female workers report being on the receiving end of. Less common, but still, affecting between a quarter to a half of all of female agricultural workers are things like unwanted touching, unwanted hugging, unwanted kissing, invitations with some sort of an advantage that might be put forward by a supervisor. And these are much more, I think, worrying, but perhaps not as common as sort of the harassing environment. Finally, some of the studies that we looked at indicated that between maybe 15 and 20% of the women workers actually reported having to were coerced into some sort of sexual activity with a supervisor or a co-worker, which is a shock. I find that a shockingly high percentage. And if you look at the scale of women in the industry, you could be talking about 10 to 20 million women having experienced something of this nature. So, I mean, these are my best guesses, but I think what I'm trying to say is there's a real need for much more effort to try to document just the incidence and form of a lot of the harassment and violence in this particular area of work. There are a number of risk factors that I think make agricultural workers stand out as particularly vulnerable. We know that they're in rural areas. They tend to come from very poor households. There may be no other opportunities for work. They may be traveling from other regions. They usually have very little skills in formal education. They're often very young. You may have single mothers who are already stigmatized in society. You have them coming from communities and entering into workplaces where sexual violence, harassment is not well understood and is not really appreciated as something that is not to be tolerated. And you also often have very weak support networks because of these attitudes coming from the home as well as the workplace. Finally, you have just the nature of farm work, and in that many times workers are housed right on the farm enterprise, living together as well as working together, and supervisors along with farm workers of different kinds. And also the places where they're working out in fields can be very isolated in getting to and from them. So there are a number of factors that really speak to why this sector may be being hit very hard by incidences of violence and harassment. So what do we have? And again, I'm taking an ILO perspective on this. And so I'm going to look at the employers themselves and say, in terms of making an environment, a work environment where workers are not subjected to this kinds of violence and harassment, what is it that is missing or what needs to be put in place? Because employers, I think, are on the front line for changing attitudes and behavior. Many do not have official policies on sexual violence and harassment. This is still a very new idea to many of these enterprises and maybe more in the industry. Since it's fairly fragmented, you still have some small and medium farm enterprises that just are not sensitized. You will very rarely find procedures for receiving and responding to complaints. Employers will likely not take action even if a complaint does reach them. You don't have any sort of a safe space or an anonymity, a protection of women who do speak out. You have these companies often very hierarchical where workers only report to their supervisors who then take it up higher up. And if it's the supervisor who is the perpetrator, then clearly there's a problem with that structure. You have very few women in agribusiness and in farm work that are at the supervisory and management levels. So there's not good representation for women at lower ranks to rely on. You have, again, the idea that workers don't complain. In a lot of these places, they just don't have a an appreciation in the agriculture sector that you have the right to complain. And these attitudes have to change. Another one is very low union representation and membership. Because they're casual workers, it's difficult for the established unions to have them as dues-paying members. And so often when they're negotiating contracts or collective bargaining, casual workers are not covered. And so in addition to the fact that you have union, very sparse union membership in some countries and in some agro industries. So that is maybe underutilized. And I already mentioned the third-party contracts. So let me briefly touch a little bit on the governance level, and because it sounds like Elizabeth's going to be able to provide a lot more on this than I can. But I think we've all heard already about the weak or missing.
1 minute.
Okay, missing legislation. And the law. So maybe the only thing I'll add is that in agriculture, you also have a lot of private sector industry codes of practice. These are mechanisms that can be used for monitoring sexual harassment and violence. And I think now that we do have conventions in this direction, that these will become more common inclusions. And as I mentioned, the idea that bargaining agreements through unions can do a lot to extend to casual workers. Now, I have a number of recommendations, but I could leave those to question and answer. What do you want me to do?
Well, if you don't mind, would you hang on to them? Because we can perhaps pull together the recommendations in the discussion. I'd just like to make sure we've got time for Liz and for Myrtle to say something. Just from what you said, and thank you for that really, really helpful overview around the agricultural sector. Just to acknowledge that we have been very clear about two things around sexual harassment that I think link to what you said. One is that sexual harassment is a continuum from looks to words to contact through to sexual assault and rape. So any form of unwelcome sexual conduct and behavior would constitute sexual harassment in our understanding of it. And it includes, as you mentioned, sexual violence and criminal acts. Secondly, we talk about unwelcomeness because in situations of inequality, consent is not actually freely given because people consent to things they do not want under conditions of inequality because they risk losing their jobs or being thrown out of college or whatever. So we talk about unwelcomeness as the standard. So thank you also for talking about how they are coerced, and that coerce is not actually about necessarily physical force. There are many other ways in which power inequalities can play out in this way. So thank you for that. And sorry to interrupt you, but if we could hold on, we could perhaps come to recommendations as a point across all of us in the discussion. Let me turn at this point, if I may, to you, Liz, for your thoughts around the informal sector. We have focused in the paper on farm workers and domestic workers in particular, but we understand the problems are broader, and you're very welcome to take us beyond those two. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks very much, Purna. And it's so wonderful to join with you, with Carla, Celeste, Myrtle, to really talk about the invisible issue of sexual harassment in the informal economy. Because I love the fact that you're looking at sexual harassment for women with disabilities, and in so many of those areas where this issue is even more hidden, because I believe that we can't fix what we don't see. So I think, Purna, by you, UN Women, convening sessions as you have over the last few months, and also for your strong leadership elevating these issues with the strong reports. So thank you, Celeste, for that. I think that's one way of actually shining a light on this issue and getting some change. It was wonderful to listen to Carla's comprehensive analysis of sexual harassment in farm work. I learned a lot, so thank you, Carla. And I thought then for me, given that we've got Carla and Myrtle with such deep expertise in the situation of workers in the informal economy, it might be worth me just sharing firstly a little bit about the working group. I never miss an opportunity to do that because we are a new mandate, and it's important that people across the world, and particularly women and civil society, women's rights activists, actually understand what it is that we do, but also then to talk about a new and emerging group of non-standard workers, and particularly women workers. And there I'd like to just touch on sexual harassment in the gig economy. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. But just coming back to the working group on discrimination against women and girls, we're one of 3 UN mandates, which is specifically directed at the human rights of women and girls. And you'll know the other 2. One is the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and of course the CEDAW treaty body. So the 3 of us together make up the human rights, women's human rights across the UN. We're a young mandate. We were created in September 2010 following the advocacy of many feminist organisations and women's organisations. And in fact, I just remember the idea of the UN mechanism, the working group, first originated in the CSW, actually, in the context of Beijing +10 review. So together with the Special Rapporteur, we sit as part of the special procedures or special mandate holders of the UN Human Rights Council. We're 2 among 44 thematic mandates, and we're the only 2 which focus on women's rights. So we engage with member states, we engage with civil society, and of course individual rights holders, but we really have 3 main levers to drive impact. Firstly, the country visits. So we undertake country visits on behalf of the Human Rights Council. We issue official communications, and annually we produce global thematic reports. And I want to talk a little bit about the report that we've done recently on women's rights in the changing world of work, and particularly looking at the issue of sexual harassment. But before I do that, just coming back to country visits. So ordinarily we would be traveling extensively. We've undertaken 17 country visits covering all regions. And we can also visit countries or states which have not ratified CEDAW. And that's the difference between the CEDAW treaty body and the UN working group. Most recently, in the last year or so, we've been to Greece, Poland, Romania, and Chad. We issue official communications, and we've issued over 300 official communications to different state governments. And I just want to give you one example of that, just to give you a feel for that. Recently, we issued a communication to a Southeast Asian country, and it just showed the gendered impacts of the response to COVID. So in this particular communication, there were a number of young women who were in the informal economy. They were street vendors, they were selling clothes. When the lockdown came in their city, they had to migrate onto the digital forums and become digital entrepreneurs. They were modeling their clothes on Facebook and selling their clothes that way. But when the Prime Minister of this state heard about what the women were doing, he issued, well, in a speech, said that there were women in the country who were damaging the reputation and morality of that country. Those women were arrested, those young women who had become digital entrepreneurs, and they were taken to jail. And indeed, it just went to show that actually, you know, in terms of countries' responses to COVID-19, lockdowns have a strongly gendered dimension in many areas. So that's the type of official communication that we would actually write. The third area is position papers to advance conceptual debates. And we've recently just done a detailed position paper on gender and the gender backlash, particularly looking at the false narrative of gender ideology, which is often used by anti-gender activists across the world. And then finally, we prepare global thematic reports. And the report that I presented to the Human Rights Council in Geneva by video link just last week was the one relating to women's rights in the changing world of work. It's the result of about 18 months of consultation with CSOs, women's rights activists, and experts in every region of the world. And it really speaks to the changing world of work. So the impact of digitization, of demographic change, of globalization, and of course, climate change. But we also look particularly at the rising levels of violence and sexual harassment to understand what recommendations to nation states would we make in relation to really reasserting gender equality and women's rights. Because in many parts of the world, as we've heard from Carla, the vast majority of women are in low-paid and vulnerable forms of work. In fact, in some low-income countries, we're seeing 92% of women are employed informally, with little access to a raft of employment and social protection rights. And not only that, as we've heard, they're concentrated in the most vulnerable forms of informal work. But one of the areas we really looked in detail at in our report was the impact of technological change. And this was even pre-COVID on the world of work. And we pointed to an emerging group of women workers with very little rights. And to that end, I'm referring to those women who are working in the gig or platform economy. Because what we know today, even since our report was finalised in March, but what we've seen over the last few months is that the COVID-19 pandemic is accelerating digitisation, and therefore it's accelerating our transition to a gig economy. Rising unemployment and economic vulnerability is also pushing people into more insecure forms of employment. So when I talk about the gig economy, I'm talking about the rise of technology platforms and applications which are transforming economies by facilitating the growth of freelancers or independent contractors who might work under 0 hours contract. They might work in temporary, flexible and other forms of precarious jobs. But there is no doubt a growing tendency which is accelerating, a growing tendency of companies and organisations to hire independent contractors and freelancers instead of full-time employees with decent work conditions. In the gig economy, laws such as labour laws, occupational health and safety, non-discrimination, and other laws that address sexual harassment and violence in the world of work, they often do not apply to gig economy workers. What we know from history is that no industrial or technological change, such as a move to the gig economy, has ever been gender neutral. The fact is, women walked into this pandemic many steps behind men. So how can we ensure that the inequalities and discrimination that we see for women in work today, that those inequalities are not replicated or indeed exacerbated in a digitised future? And what we're hearing is that with the shift to the gig economy, while some women might, in some countries, might be able to access more flexibility and choice, particularly those with caring responsibilities, on the other hand, in so many countries of the world, women are left without basic work entitlements and without basic protection from sexual harassment and violence at work. The growth of these digital platforms will likely contribute to heightening women's economic inequality by increasing the informalization of women's work. And when I think about the gig economy, I often think back to the expansion of informal work, which for so many centuries women have traditionally undertaken. And I think it was Purna who referred to women as peace workers. And in a sense, there's the possibility of returning to that situation, but instead of having traditional sweatshops, we've really got digital sweatshops, which are using a technological platform. But with that comes the traditional and same risks. So these women in non-standard casual temporary employment, they're more likely to be picked out for sexual harassment. And that's because of their lack of employment protection, their insecure status, and the absence of power, every one of them making them easy targets. And as Purna said before, sexual harassment happens in a context, and that context is rooted in a system of gender inequality and intersecting forms of discrimination. Certain groups are impacted more than others, and whilst we don't yet have strong data on how women and girls fare in a gig economy, their lack of protection would suggest that they will fare poorly. Because when you look at the gig economy and where women are connected by a platform to work, but they're acting as independent agents or freelancers, that work often happens in people's homes or in their cars or in confined private spaces where both the client and the worker are made vulnerable. And in that regard, I'm thinking of apps like Airtasker, Uber, Lyft, any other matching apps that match an individual to work. And when I look at some of the research in those scenarios, female workers often report being sexually harassed. So they're hit on, they're being offered drugs, they're being solicited for sex and asked for sexual favors in these environments. Now, as we know, sexual harassment...
I'll ask you to wrap up shortly if you may. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Can happen to anyone, anywhere. But I think what the research is showing us, and some of the surveys that have been done, is that well over 50% of self-employed and freelance women report being harassed on multiple occasions. We've identified some good practices in our report. In the Q&A, I'm happy to take you to a number of them, and also to some of the international conventions, particularly the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention, which for the first time provides widespread protection. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Liz, and I'm sorry to have interrupted you as well as Carla. I do hope we've got some time in the discussion to come back to some of the things that you perhaps didn't feel you had time to raise. Again, with what you said, I'd just like to pick up on a theme that comes through. One is that both you and Carla, and I'm sure Myrtle also will refer to, the inequality that's created through poor contracts, lack of contracts, being underpaid, not having legal protection and so on, perhaps often having low education levels, which Carla mentioned. I think there's sometimes a danger of people saying, well, this is an intrinsic vulnerability in the women involved. I think it's important we don't think of it that way, because these are actual structural inequalities that are created, and these inequalities are abused by those in power who can create those conditions or could equally amend and change those conditions. And it is absolutely the case that that the people who are seen as easy pickings are those who are targeted for sexual harassment. And so the problematic lies in the perpetrator rather than the conditions in which the target finds himself. You absolutely have not said that, Liz. I just wanted to set it in that context. And the other thing that I think is important is that where women in these circumstances have organized, we have seen effective advocacy and campaigning for the sorts of changes that Liz, you just mentioned with the new ILO convention, which we should perhaps come back to in our discussion. And I don't know if Myrtle will want to say something about that, but let me turn to her now. And before she speaks, let me also remind people that there is a Q&A box in which they can put questions and comments that we'll come to in the discussion after we've heard from the speaker. So please feel free to do that. But I'd like to turn with great pleasure now to Myrtle, who will talk presumably about domestic workers. They were organising how sexual harassment plays out in contexts where people are in other people's, workers are in other people's homes. Myrtle, may I hand over to you now? Thank you.
Okay, it's so great to be here. After listening to all the professional speakers, I must say I feel a bit, nervous because of the fact, but I'm going to talk about the reality and about what really happening in the domestic sector. So this is what I will talk about today. I think that, domestic workers are the most invisible workers. And domestic workers are women of all colors. And also, we are women that's been oppressed by other women, women that's been oppressed by society, women that's been oppressed by the economic world. So what is it that we want? What is it that we really want people to understand about us? We need to understand we are urban, we are rural, we are migrant workers. We are away from our families. We are open to abuse because we are staying on the premises of the employers. Now, we also need to understand that many sacrifices have been made by domestic workers to leave their countries to come and work in other countries. But does that mean that we want to be abused? Does it mean that we want to be sexual harassment? So, over the last couple of years, before we formed the International Domestic Workers Federation, before we even start talking, when we be in the ILO, when we had that big day of victory, when we got Convention 189. But Convention 189 has said, respect our privacy. And then we move on to Convention 190. Convention 190 says protect the workplace. But if we look in reality to domestic workers, we find that domestic workers, sexual harassment is coupled to abuse, because we find the two work together. Because of the fact that we are isolated, because of the fact that we have no voice, because of the fact that the economic pressure of the employer having the money, whenever we have sexual harassment or we are abused, the employer has the money to employ a lawyer. The poor domestic worker has only her voice. And often we find when the domestic worker want to speak out, you find that she's pressurized. You are either from another country, you are either staying in my backroom, you listen to what I'm saying. So what are we saying? What is the way out for domestic workers? We are saying the IDWF is taking up a campaign. They are saying that in the next 3 years, we must really focus on abuse and sexual harassment of domestic workers. We are also saying as the IDWF that we are going to produce a booklet which is going to make it easy for domestic workers to understand their rights as workers. In South Africa, what is happening in South Africa, similar to what is happening now, the COVID-19 has really bring out the abuse and the harassment of domestic workers. We are really facing for the first time with the reality of what is really happening to domestic workers within the world, within our countries. We are finding that domestic workers are still so oppressed. We are finding that domestic workers sometimes, like we discovered a week ago, domestic workers don't even understand the abuse and the sexual harassment. Sometimes they find my employer is so nice, my employer hugged me, my employer did this. They find it that, oh, I'm so special, but they're not really special, they don't realize. So certainly there should be education, and here the UN Women must also come in. There should be education on sexual harassment, stroke abuse. How does this two work together? Yesterday we had a court case in the court about the domestic workers. She is struggling since 2015 to get her case to court. She got a case to court yesterday. What happened? We don't have an interpreter for you, and the employer speaks in his own language. The domestic worker lost the use of her arm. She cannot work anymore. The employer stood there proudly with two lawyers. The domestic worker had to stand outside of the court. So the reality is, we really need to put pressure on making the Convention 189 and 190 start working for the vulnerable sector. We need to ensure that the voices of domestic workers are more heard. What's happening now with webinars, Zoom, with all this? Domestic workers have no clue. Domestic workers don't understand. They don't have smartphones. They don't have all that. So how are we going to reach domestic workers? How are we going to make sure that domestic workers will understand? It's not about their niceness. It's not that they're so kind to me. It's the way they abuse me. It is the way. For instance, I stay on the premises. I go to my room. I'm working for a male, a male employer. He calls me to come inside to do something. When I'm inside, whatever, he promised me things like that. But in my own mind, my mind is settled on my family. My mind is thinking about my children that must go to school. My mind is thinking, I need to work. But my question is it really necessary that I have to be abused like that? The problem is here, so many people come aboard, so many professionals, and I love to say academics. They come on board, they write books, they talk about domestic workers. But really, when are we going to really put our words in action? When are we really going to give that domestic worker that open door? She should feel free to go to a lawyer. She should feel free to speak out for herself. So what is this COVID-19 done to us? The COVID-19 has shown us the lack of the implementation of the labor laws. It has shown us the lack of many labor laws is on paper. It is not in reality helping us as domestic workers. It shows us also what's happening in Lebanon, what's happening in all these countries. Domestic workers are abused by just sitting outside, being thrown out of their jobs because there's no jobs. So now we are going to face the worst thing of domestic workers. We are facing unemployment. We are facing domestic workers losing their income. We are facing domestic workers, they don't know which way to go. So this is what I call economic abuse, because the money is still in the hands of the employers. The employers have still got to say, I'm not paying you. So I'm saying, let the Sexual Harassment Code really start working for domestic workers. And support the IDWF. We have also started funds for domestic workers. We have also started, solidarity funds. But that's not the answer. The answer is teach us to speak up for ourselves. Teach us your body belongs to you. It is yours. And you can say no. Help us to understand all that laws that's there, the ILO laws, every law that is there. We have many years ago, we have so many things that we discussed about. 25 years later, we're still discussing the same thing. How long are we going to discuss it? How long are we going to talk about freedom? How long are we going to talk about how do we really protect the farm worker and the domestic worker? How do we really make sure that our voices are heard? When they draw up papers, do they call us in? Do they talk to us? So this is the reality of domestic workers. And this is what I want to bring across, that when we produce the manual, it should be in all languages. The IDWF is trying their best to let our voices be heard. The IDWF is trying our best to let domestic workers through this epidemic so that we can go on. But again, how strong is my voice? How strong is my voice? In South Africa, we have cases from 2015, we have cases from 2016, we have cases from 2019. Where is that cases? It is just there, the employer gets a fine. Thank you, we see you again. The employer has got the power. So I think that it's for us to empower ourselves, to say to ourselves, now I'm going to speak up for myself. I know my rights, I know. So the call is here. Let Convention 189, let Convention 190 become a reality for the domestic workers. Only if we can draw that workers in the mainstream, only if we can let that workers understand you have got two powerful tools. But if it's going to remain on fancy paper, it's not going to help us at all. So my message is clear. Support the IDWF, support domestic workers, and help us to speak as for ourselves. Help us to stop the abuse of domestic workers. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you the plight of reality and what is really happening in the domestic workers situation. I thank you.
Myrtle, amazing. I've heard you speak a few times, which is why I was really keen to invite you today, and I'm very grateful you made time. Thank you so much. You say about the professionals there and nervousness. I think it takes each of us doing our separate parts and joining together collectively to complement each other's work. What we do at the UN will be different to what you do as an organizer, different to what Carla does as a researcher. Liz is involved in a mechanism. I think, your work and what you do with the women on the front line has to be the basis for everything else that all of us does. So your contribution here, your representation of domestic workers, and raising hard questions, holding us to account, is absolutely right. So thank you very much for that, Myrtle. Don't go. We're going to have some more discussion. And I do want to come back to all of you a little bit about what do we do? What are the recommendations of action? How do we do what Myrtle's calling for? Support, enable the people on the front line who are not recognized by laws, who are abused every day, don't have legal support and advice. Those who are caught in the gaps between all these wonderful mechanisms that we set up. How do we ensure that doesn't continue? Before I do that, I'm going to just turn to Celeste, who drafted the paper. I should say the paper will be going up online, hopefully in about a week. But Celeste will tell us a little bit about what's in it and the process of producing it. Celeste.
Thank you, Purna. Well, first of all, thank you all for taking the time to participate in this important discussion today. And thank you to the panelists for their inspiring words and for sharing their knowledge and experience. So as you already mentioned, with this webinar, we are introducing the topic of our upcoming publication, and I will tell you very briefly about that. So the paper was a result of an extensive literature review, but also of consultations with domestic and workers' organizations and NGO. The paper opens with an overview and a gender analysis of the informal economy and the incidence of sexual harassment before going in depth in two sections on farm workers and domestic workers. One of the key elements that we discuss is how the lack of social and legal protections of these workers impacts, first of all, their chances to be targeted by perpetrators of sexual harassment, but also their ability to leave abusive workplaces and their ability to seek justice and redress. The paper, however, also identifies and discusses how women's and workers' organizations have taken actions against sexual harassment with a number of case studies. And finally, we provide a list of promising practices for both governments and civil society organizations. The publication will be available in approximately 2 weeks at the end of August on the page of our office. We will now share the link in the chat of where you'll be able to find it, and we hope that it will be a helpful resource. And I'll leave you back to the panelists and wish you a good discussion. Thank you, Purna.
Thank you, Celeste, and congratulations on moving this really important work forward. Thank you for that. I'm quite aware we have a few questions coming up in the Q&A. I'm also aware that I cut two speakers short who might want to come back on some of the things that they didn't cover. May I first just draw attention to what is in the Q&A and see who'd like to come in on that. So let me just, first of all, there's a comment that's come from some participants, and perhaps I should also acknowledge this as well. Not all domestic workers and farm workers are in the informal economy. That's absolutely right, and perhaps I should have made that clearer. There are many who work through formal arrangements, who are perhaps working with agencies, contracted and so on. What we want to focus on in this particular discussion and in the work that surrounds it is that there are many, many millions, as Carla and Elizabeth have said, millions who are not in those formal arrangements, not in formal vision of the law and the policies that are in place. What of them? What of those who are, Myrtle says they are invisible. The word invisible has been used by several of our speakers. Those who are really, really not at the center of public attention and are not easily captured in the public gaze. I do think we do have an obligation to ensure that our commitment, certainly made at the high level, like, leaving nobody behind, which is part of the UN's project now for Agenda 2030. How do we really deliver on these very grand promises and obligations and all these international arrangements that have meaning? How do we deliver in a way that actually significantly impacts and improves the realization of rights for women and men also, because men are also sexually harassed, who are so far from the center of our attention? And the work that Myrtle's doing and others who organize is so crucial to ensuring that their voices and their experience have a more central place in our deliberations. So let's ensure that happens. We had the same discussion around disabilities last week. People with disabilities haven't been at the core of our work, and their slogan, nothing about us without us, applies not only to them, which is absolutely core, but to all of those in whose name we do this work. So just to clarify those as principles and key points. So let me then just turn to some of the questions. Somebody is asking, who is this, Evelyn, moral harassment is the gateway to sexual harassment. All types of harassment are very harmful to the victims, who most of the time just suffer silently. The situation is critical in formal workplaces and worst in informal economy, where there's no policies. How could one manage to bring support to victims such as domestic workers? Carla, I stopped you before you talked about recommendations earlier. And Myrtle has also said something about what we need to do. But I think this question allows us to focus a little bit more on how. Well, actually, I think it raises two issues. One, how do we ensure that those who are most marginal become more centered? and are offered effective protection. But secondly, also, I think, the question asked about formal and informal, I think there are some issues that are common across all work: recognition of sexual harassment, the stigma that attaches to speaking, how hard it is to deal with the consequences of perhaps going against your supervisor or your boss, and other areas, other things that are specific to informal work. Let me go around in the order in which you spoke. Carla, would you like to come in at this point?
Yeah, thanks very much. And those are very good points to come back to and sort of elaborate on. I think the point is well received, that a lot of agricultural work in commercial agriculture is not informal. They may have contracts. They may be even contracted through a third party. It's more that it's very non-standard. It's short-term. It may be a number of contracts. In order to get the next one, you have to do certain things on the current one. And it's extremely non-transparent, isolated working conditions, and where a lot of labor rights are violated, not just this one. So it's it's sort of the industry, but it's also the fact that, non-standard work arrangements, even in the formal sector, make people very vulnerable. So that's certainly a good point to bring out. So in that context, what is it you can do to protect them? And maybe laws are not going to be the best way to take forward, unless those laws are written in a way to get around sort of formal employment relationships, where you're really looking at sort of like we've written a lot of the core conventions, where every worker is covered. You don't need to ratify this. It is a basic human right. And I think that can then provide the impetus for a different level or intensity of governance, looking at it in different ways. But I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. So let me go back to other channels, and I want to go back to civil society and unions, because a lot of times laws and international standards fall short, and they get lost in the stage of translation and implementation, and really a follow-up in terms of accountability. Whereas unions and civil society, community organizations are quite close and can have the wherewithal to really follow through on a lot of these issues and bring improvements and see that those improvements are sort of embraced and maintained. And so to me, if you're working with informal workers, working through informal worker organizations, and also getting more formal organizations like unions to extend their services and membership to those workers, whether they're formal but non-standard or informal, that they can also count on some sort of union or other civil society representation. Did I cover it all?
Yeah, that's quite a lot. Thank you, Carla. Liz, yes, please do come in.
And I agree with everything that Carla's said, and just picking up the collective organising and particularly the union movement. I mean, we consulted in every region of the world for our report on women's rights in the changing world of work. And what we heard very clearly is that the way unions are currently constructed is often quite alienating of the specific needs of women. And in fact, we made quite a strong recommendation that trade unions should introduce specific measures to ensure women's equal representation in decision making, because we figured if that happened, this issue would absolutely go up on the priorities. But I think just as an extension of that, we found some really great women's cooperatives. And, it's been fantastic to hear from Myrtle of the lived experience, and particularly with IDWF, that there's such a strong commitment to this area, I think is so very important. My fear is that COVID will mean that with austerity regimes playing out in pretty much every country of the world, that we're going to see the funding base for, really important and effective CSOs and women's cooperatives and other things start to shrink, which will mean that the campaigns that are necessary to ensure that everyone knows what their rights are and to actually then, have full enjoyment of their rights will be more limited. So we need something to shake that up. I do agree that a convention like the ILO Convention 190, it's just so important in setting a benchmark, because it recognises everyone's right to a world of work free from violence and harassment, and particularly gender-based violence and harassment. And I love in the thing about the ILO convention that the term worker is about all workers, irrespective of a contractual status, and absolutely including those in the informal economy. So I think having a strong, normative framework, but the trouble is, how do you implement that law, which is exactly what Myrtle's talking about, and there's a gap between the law and the implementation, and that's why organisations like Myrtle's are just so important, I think.
Absolutely, thank you, Liz. And I think some of what you said we'll come back to. Myrtle, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, sometimes I can be a little bit out of order, but I think when it comes to the domestic sector, I'm very passionate. My plea would be that 25 years ago, we went to Beijing. We cried, we put everything on paper, we come back, it was produced. 25 years later, it's still standing still. 2011, we've got Convention 189. It's beautiful on paper. Many countries have implemented or put it on, at a reality. 2019, we go back, Convention 190. We now got so many conventions. We've got Sexual Harassment Code. We've got everything possible you want to talk about in the world. We've got it. But when is it going to become a reality? 7 years ago, there was a book produced by the UN Woman. Punsila, whatever. Oh, this book was so great. I don't know if you know about this. A thick book. I went over there in New York. We talk about this book. In this book, Beijing was the sexual harassment, all those things. We've got so many powerful tools. We've got so many, lots of resolutions. But the time has now come. Stop talking. Let us really start to implement. I think this COVID-19 has really pushed us to the limit now. COVID-19 has made us realize the lack of the implementation of the farm workers, of the women workers, and the IDWF. I think we've got a big role to play in the country because we are spreading out in the world. We are talking for those workers that may not be able to speak for themselves. So my message is clear. Let us really start going forward with a positive webinar on saying, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to free the domestic worker. Let them become part of the economic. Let them know that we add to the economy. And also let them know nothing is possible without us because we are there for all of them. So thank you very much, Purna.
No, thank you, Myrtle. And perhaps on your endpoint, we could remember the term that you will use in the IDWF and all domestic, the work that makes all other work possible is what you say. And, if it weren't for what you were doing, so many professionals who you referred to at the beginning of your comments wouldn't be doing their jobs. And I think, that valuation and those in the farms and in the fields, we wouldn't be eating but for their work. We wouldn't actually be able to live if it weren't for them doing what they do. So I think we do have not only a personal obligation, all of us, to be there for each other, but also to understand the justice that we pursue to be incomplete if it doesn't touch everybody's lives. So I hope that we can just keep talking. We have a little bit longer now about what the specific steps are that we need to take. Myrtle, you're right on that. And there's everybody who expresses frustration at some point about the many laws and conventions and treaties and so on that we have. And what do we need to do to make them have meaning in the lives of people to whom they make the promises and obligations. But I think your camera's frozen. I hope you can hear and just come back to us when you feel connection's good. I'm just going to move on to the next question here. It actually comes from Kate Jenkins, who's up rather late tonight. And she says, in a way that she's touched on what we were already talking about, do the panelists foresee that labour laws could develop in a way to better protect the growing population of informal and temporary workers, rather than allowing them, especially women, to continue to fall through the gaps? Carla, I'll come to you again first.
Again, I'm going to point out that I'm not a lawyer, so I am a little bit reluctant to comment authoritatively on this. But of course, I think laws can be crafted, and certainly by having these additional mechanisms like codes of practice and recommendations that go into much more specifics of how laws can be crafted, can be extended to the informal economy. And the codes of practice that in the private sector are also, in a way, helping to address some of the informal economy shortcomings, as can other mechanisms. I don't have a definitive answer on this, but I think the laws can be crafted. It's been used in different ways for other problems, but there's a lot of attention that needs to be paid to capacity building, training, again, rank and file. It's not just having the laws, it's people knowing how to interpret and apply those laws. And that goes down very far into regulatory levels, down into local levels. So it's a huge effort.
Thank you, Carla. But Liz, you might want to say something around law specifically.
Yeah, look, I agree with Carla, and thanks, Kate. She is up very late. It's wonderful to have Kate, and I just want to congratulate Kate also on the work that she's done in Australia, which is my country. I'm coming to you from Sydney, but to really review all our laws here in Australia and to propose some really quite disruptive ideas, which I hope are going to lead to a much greater strengthening of the legal framework that we have here to respond to sexual harassment. And indeed, one of our main recommendations from our thematic report to the Human Rights Council was that countries need to introduce and strengthen their legal frameworks to ensure coverage for all types of workers. And we said specifically workers in non-standard employment. And not only that, the sexual harassment laws should apply to all workplaces, including public spaces, transport, online and digital work platforms. And just picking up on Carla's point, it's not just enough to have the laws. We also need the complaints mechanisms. We need labour inspections. I mean, what if, for example, a country carried out labour inspections into private homes where domestic workers were? Would we see a shift in the treatment of domestic workers? I mean, so there's some of the things that we were recommending. Just coming back though, I think the law can do so much. I do think some of the partnerships that we've seen, and we identified one, Purna, which was UN Women's Partnership with Unilever to improve women's safety in the tea industry. It was a human rights intervention program to focus on women's safety in Unilever's supply chain in the tea industry. And my understanding from talking to people who are quite close to that is that, Unilever's commitment to implement policies and processes across the supply chain that women trust. Firstly, that they have trust in the process, because let's face it, most women do not trust complaints processes or whatever. But that has been quite effective in also addressing some of the prevailing social and cultural norms and the behavioural factors. And I know the other thing that Unilever's done from talking to that organisation, that actually they have put many women as supervisors of a tea plantation. They said the single most effective disruptive action against, limiting sexual harassment was to put more women supervisors in tea plantations. And I think most of their tea plantations now have women who are supervising them. So we identified quite a number of promising practices, the laws being one, but the other thing, as I said, is just looking at some of the unions in countries who are pushing for legislative change also to ensure that informal workers are picked up in the laws in those countries.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. Those are really great points. We actually have given some examples in the paper. People will be able to see when it's online of some of these initiatives. You've spoken about Unilever, which is a great one. There are some examples from South America and elsewhere, and the Immokalee worker tomato growers in the US. And also, Myrtle, we've talked about IDWF and how it came about and how important it's been. I want to endorse what Carla and Liz both said, that I think there's a value, and Kate, thanks for the question, I think there's a value in getting our laws right. And that's what I think the ILO conventions point the way to. the inclusion of informal workers, the inclusion of the use of an understanding of work which is broad and beyond a given workplace, journeys to and from work, where people take breaks and so on. It's an incredibly helpful and broad understanding that the convention offers, and C189, which Myrtle talked about before, has been a very significant step towards recognizing domestic workers as workers. Part of the problem is that many laws don't even recognize informal sector workers as workers, so don't give them a legal presence at all. So the value of the law is pretty close to minimal, pretty close to zero, and minimal at best. But the law, valuable though it is, isn't the totality of the universe of making change. and that's why we've also in our work tried to draw attention to the context in which laws sit and the importance of organizing, which all our speakers have talked about. C189 would not have come about had domestic workers not been fantastic organizers, agitators, and advocates. And I will just say here, as somebody who's often on the receiving end and in institutions where we're at the receiving end, I think we have to be made to feel uncomfortable. I think, Myrtle, you're right to say, what use is all of this if it doesn't filter through to people's lives? And challenge and push those who are in a position to make those changes to ensure that they do that. And on that point, let me pick up Elizabeth Tang's comment here in the Q&A, which is, could we pull our energy together to create a strong campaign in one place for some visible results? I think that would be impactful, not only in that place, but elsewhere. Is it a campaign that's missing now? Is it agitation and advocacy rather than legal change? So Liz, let me come to you on that one. Is it campaigning that's the challenge now?
Look, I think we need to do both, to be honest. And it's interesting, I was just sitting here reflecting on how many requests for official communications we've had to the working group on domestic workers and sexual harassment. And in the time that I've been there, I'd have to say none. So I'm just thinking it would be fantastic, because in terms of being able to mobilize and bring some global attention to these issues, using the official communication function is one way to do that. So that is about an organization like IDWF bringing to the working group a number of cases of sexual harassment of domestic workers, which we can then gather more information about and put directly to that particular country. Then we're asking for a response, and at that point we can publish both our communication and their response and use it as a kind of pivotal point to maybe build off a greater campaign, advocacy campaign. Interestingly, unlike the CEDAW treaty body, you don't have to exhaust domestic remedies or anything in your own country. You can come to the working group at any time. And a lot of women's rights activists and CSOs, they use us as a key to their stronger advocacy. So they use us as part of an advocacy and communication strategy in a way that they're not able to access just by themselves. So, I mean, I just flag that. If people are interested in more information, we could send information to those who've dialed into the call. I'm very happy to put together just a little pack about that, because I think that's one way of raising visibility. But I do think, why wouldn't you kind of select a country, one that's doing it particularly badly, and we have a strong focus on that country, and almost use that as a springboard to really raise this at a more global issue? Because I couldn't agree more with Myrtle. We're at a point in time where, as Myrtle says, it's essentially reaching a tipping point or a crisis point.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. I also appreciate Myrtle's focus on the moment we're in now, the COVID-19 moment, where I think a lot of things are changing. You talked about the increased speed of digitization and platform-based work. Myrtle's talked about, the clampdown. You also mentioned potentially austerity, getting a firmer hold on economic policy measures. I'm also concerned about issues of safety. Speaking about abuse that's happened to you has always been risky, because it tends to be the more powerful who you are challenging and who you are seeking to hold to account. That's always risky. And we know those who have denounced sexual harassment, sexual violence of a variety of forms, have often paid for doing so. And too often they've paid with their lives. Often they pay with their jobs and lacking them. And that, I think, connects to one of the questions that someone else has asked here. Let me just find it again. Evelyn says, fear of, Carla, I was going to come to you in just a moment, if I may. The fear of losing jobs is stronger than the suffering of the harassment and the abuse. What do we do about that? And on that, let's again focus and bring our attention to agriculture and farm work. We don't want to lose that in this discussion. Carla, I wanted to bring you in here if you wanted to tie to what we had before, but also this fear of losing jobs. People on low pay, they often are in this work because they don't have options and alternatives. And so the fear of losing their work is very significant. What are the options here?
Well, I think I want to make a comment on the previous question as well. But let me just say, I think it goes back to the idea of not putting the responsibility of solving the problem onto the victims. These women are not in a position to necessarily change what's wrong. And that's why you have to say, who is responsible for that change? And it's where the employers, the supervisors, the managers, the industry to some extent have accountability for making sure that there is a safe place for people to work. And whether it's formal or informal, there are basic rights that people have in their workplace and they have to be respected. So, to me, the onus is on governance to sort of be hands-on in ensuring that the employers recognize that responsibility and take the steps necessary to curtail and eventually eliminate it from the workplace. If that's okay, on the previous question, I in terms of should there be sort of a campaign in one country, I wanted to just make an analogy to the work that's been done in the area of child labor. And how this has been, I think, a theme where a lot of UN agencies have been able to come together to look at national campaigns to raise awareness and help governments to, develop strategies and take actions to try to eliminate especially unacceptable forms of labor for children. And one component in that is to really develop methodology and document the incidence of it so you can really monitor progress over time. And then in addition, you have interventions, you have awareness raising, you have legal, support. But these have been fairly successful in getting UN agencies to come together in a particular country to support a collective effort. And I do think that it could be done for any sectoral intervention around sexual violence and harassment. And I think that in developing countries, there are certain sectors or industries that really should be prioritized. And you have hit two of them today with domestic workers and farm workers. So.
Thank you, Carla. And thank you, Carla. And let me just say, to acknowledge Vicky Kanyoko, who's made a comment saying it's high time the UN agencies team together and work closely with the partners like IDWF on C189 and 190. And I hope that's what we're trying to, support efforts towards here, and that continues. Liz, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to make one comment on that because I couldn't agree more, Purna. And one of the things that we've recognised in the working group is that if we don't stand firm with others who care about women's human rights, particularly at this point in time, it's so easy to undermine the whole system. So, for example, we hold some of our meetings or portion of our meeting, we hold it jointly with the CEDAW treaty body. We do a lot of work with the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. We do a lot of work with the regional mechanisms through what we call the platform, because we've realised that there's so much backlash at the minute, particularly on women's rights and LGBTIQ rights, that if we don't stand as one, we just open ourselves up for more and more pushback. And so I think the idea that UN Women, we would come and the other UN mandates would come together with really strong civil society organisations and women's cooperatives and whatever. There's never been a more important time to present a unified approach and to reach out to each other.
Thank you, Liz, and I want to endorse what you said completely. Let me also just second what Carla was saying about shifting the responsibility from workers who've been abused to make change, to employers, to workplaces, and to governance systems and structures to build places that are free of sexual harassment. There's something that I tend to call this almost compulsion to report. Employers always say, well, they didn't tell us, or, you know, you've got to report, how can we act unless you report? You know, that's in a way acknowledging and accepting that there's always going to be sexual harassment, and nobody has an obligation to act until they are told about what's happening. Well, actually, no. Everybody has an obligation to create a workplace that is free from violence and harassment. You know, an individual's right to that, as set out in C190, is dependent on other people making that workplace absolutely safe and equal for their participation. And so I think there's two things that have to be done. One is to create those circumstances in which sexual harassment doesn't happen. But also, for those who do want to report, and there's always going to be people who won't, that reporting has to be a rational, sensible thing to do, with an outcome, with a timeline, with communications, with transparency about what's happened, with equality of treatment for those who reported and those who allegedly perpetrated sexual harassment. I mean, I've always argued that at the moment in most places, reporting and making complaints is not the sensible thing to do. Why would you do it? Why would you put yourself through that? The cost is too high. The uncertainty is too high. So yes, we have to improve reporting and the potential routes to justice through reporting, but we also have to create the spaces where people aren't abused in the first place. Before we wrap up, we've got just a few minutes left. I think Myrtle has lost her connection, Elizabeth just told us. Elizabeth Tang, her colleague at IDWS, just told us. So let me turn to you, Elizabeth and Carla, just for your last wrap-up comments before we close up today. Elizabeth, let me come to you first. You're on my screen, so let me come to you first.
Yeah. I suppose just in wrapping up, what can I say? Because it does seem a daunting and huge challenge. I mean, sexual harassment generally, even in organisations with decent work, we know all the issues there, and I couldn't agree more that you won't hear about it. You have to actively and intentionally go and seek it out. When we take it even into the informal sector, it's even more deeply hidden for all the reasons that we've heard about. But I think if I could just make a plea, and also coming back to Carla, it's not on, we can't put it on the individual woman who's the most vulnerable and experiencing this behaviour. Also, for most of the women I work with, they just want the behaviour to stop. It's not like they're asking for huge amounts of money or whatever. They want the sexual harassment to stop. And so I think I come back to the role of a working group, because our role is to hold governments to account. And it's on the government to keep women safe in individual states or nations. So it's on them to step up the priority and the attention and focus they give to sexual harassment generally, but particularly sexual harassment in the informal sector. So I would love to see many communications coming to us, which we could then really action and hold that state accountable for doing something about that situation.
Liz, before you go, there is a question about law that if you might want to address it from Habiba Osman, who says, can you advise whether there are countries which have noted that having a specific sexual harassment law as opposed to those that have it in other statutes is more effective? Is a standalone law more effective?
I think the best practice is absolutely standalone sexual harassment laws. So a strong sexual harassment law, which also covers informal workers. And what we're recommending to states is, just trying to pick up our recommendation, we said that that the law must ensure coverage for all types of workers, but particularly workers in non-standard employment. It must apply to all workplaces, including public spaces, transport, online and digital work platforms, and it should also include complaints mechanisms and labour inspections. So there's some of the things I think that would be, you know, a really strong sexual harassment law in a country.
Yes, and that endorses what Elizabeth also said in the Q&A. Thank you, Liz. Carla, any last wrap-up comments from you, particularly, there's something around C189 and 190 in the questions that mostly it's been workers and trade unions who've been pushing on this and been familiar with it, but also given how little attention there is around agricultural work and sexual harassment, if there's something you'd like to say there to wrap up, you'd be very welcome.
Maybe I could say something in what I observed looking at a particular sector, industry, and women's, and the problems may be unique to that particular type of work, but the solutions are often the same for others, and that is to empower women, to get women regularized employment contracts, to sensitize managers and supervisors, to have labor inspectors coming in and specifically looking for this. So we have the mechanisms in place a lot of times that can easily be used to leverage work to rapidly address sexual violence and harassment in the workplace, because we already have it for occupational safety and health and for basic rights. And so, you know, let's not, you know, try to recreate or start from scratch. There's so many things that this can be integrated into.
Thank you very much, Carla. And let me just acknowledge a couple of other questions before we close. Faiza Mohammed, so Faiza is at Quality now, saying that the African protocol has been a useful tool that they've used there, and they feel they're making some progress with that regionally in terms of dealing with these issues. And someone else has said, this is, can't see the name, Barbara Budin, who has talked about Chiquita as well as Unilever, and I'd just like to acknowledge both of those examples, and we have cited them in the paper that will be going up online very soon, we hope. I'm very grateful for everybody who's joined us today and to the speakers for incredible input, and I'm sorry we lost Myrtle. I think Myrtle's role in being absolutely clear and unequivocal in her advocacy for those for whom she represents, for those who are very little seen and heard in public policy debates, is crucial to moving us forward and to holding all of us, and governments in particular, to accounts, and us who stand by them, hopefully, and try to move this agenda forward. I hope we'll see a little bit more attention around farm work and agricultural work. Carla, I think there's a job of work to do to make sure that that's more visible and better recognized in terms of the challenges there and the work that needs to be done. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Liz. Really, really helpful presentations and lots of information that I hope will help people move forward with this. I like the idea of a campaign to focus around informal work. I hope we can make space to continue that conversation. I think it's true we have a lot of laws and tools and formal mechanisms in place. Liz, thank you for the invitation for people to use your mechanism more than they do now. I think that will be helpful. And I think the task is, you know, some of the commenters have said in the Q&A and chat boxes, is to move beyond them and to make them real. And that will involve going around advocacy about what exists, but also pressure for what other changes we still need to make. The organisation, the associations, the trade unions. But let me say also that those activists need to be safe in their work. Human rights defenders are not always safe in their work. They pay too high a price, and their funding around the shelters and the organisations that provide support to workers who've been sexual harassment isn't secure, and it needs to be secure and it needs to be predictable. So those are all different elements of what would perhaps come together to make significant change. All support to the women's organisations on the front lines, the associations that are organising. So let me thank everybody today, and let me thank also Susie, who's been doing the captions. Thank you to Celeste for taking this work forward and drafting the paper, and to everybody who joined us online. Our last webinar, if I might just add, is 2 days away on Thursday the 20th with our advisor on sexual harassment, Professor Catherine McKinnon, with Mara Ilarisi, and we have one other person who is going to join us. So I'm just going to confirm when we close the webinar, and I will tweet a link to join that webinar on Thursday. Thank you all. I hope we move forward together and everybody stays well during this pandemic and after. Thank you all. Bye-bye for now.